The Messerschmitt Bf-109 G6 screamed through the winter sky over Brandenburg, its Daimler-Benz engine roaring at full throttle as Oberleutnant Klaus Reinhardt wrestled with the control stick. Below him, the frozen landscape of eastern Germany stretched endlessly, a patchwork of snow-covered fields and dark forests that blurred into abstraction at 400 kilometers per hour. But Klaus wasn't looking down. His entire attention was fixed on the American P-51 Mustang and had just appeared in his peripheral vision, banking hard to port, trying to shake him loose. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you're enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Klaus's hands moved with practiced precision, adjusting throttle and trim, but something felt different today. The new Revy C/12D gun sight mounted in his cockpit wasn't behaving like the standard reflector sight he'd trained with for the past 2 years. 3 days ago, technicians from Zeiss had installed what they called the K-14 modification, supposedly just an improved gyroscopic computing sight licensed from the Americans themselves, captured from a downed Mustang near Aachen and reverse engineered by German optical engineers working around the clock in underground facilities. The reticle in his sight was dancing, moving independently of his aircraft's orientation. It tracked the Mustang ahead of him with an uncanny fluidity that made Klaus's stomach tighten with a mixture of excitement and unease. He'd been briefed that the gyroscopic mechanism would help compensate for deflection angles during high G turns, making accurate shooting easier. What they hadn't told him was that it would feel like the sight itself was alive, hunting. Klaus pulled back on the stick, climbing to gain an altitude advantage. The Mustang pilot was good, probably a veteran with dozens of missions under his belt, flying with the confidence of someone who'd survived this long by being better than the enemy. The American aircraft rolled inverted and dove, a classic defensive maneuver designed to force the pursuer to overshoot. Klaus had seen it 100 times before. But this time, instead of manually calculating the lead angle and deflection, instead of relying on instinct and hours of training, Klaus simply kept the Mustang within his field of vision. The K-14's reticle followed the target like a predator tracking prey, the circular pipper adjusting continuously, expanding and contracting as the range changed, shifting position to account for the relative motion between the two aircraft. The gyroscopes inside the sight housing spun at thousands of revolutions per minute, mechanical calculators performing ballistic computations faster than any human mind could manage. Klaus's finger tightened on the trigger. The reticle settled onto the Mustang's fuselage with a precision that felt wrong, too perfect, too easy. 2 seconds of sustained fire from his twin 13mm MG-131 machine guns and single 20mm MG-151/20 cannon sent a stream of tracers across the sky. The Mustang shuddered, smoke trailing from its engine cowling. The American pilot didn't bail out immediately. He was still fighting, still trying to coax his damaged aircraft into a landing approach. Klaus didn't pursue. Something in his chest felt hollow as he watched the Mustang limp toward the distant airfield at Strasbourg, trailing a banner of black smoke. He'd been flying combat missions since 1943. Had 17 confirmed kills to his name, but never before had victory felt so mechanical, so divorced from skill. He keyed his radio. Adler lead to Adler 2. Confirm visual on target status. Static crackled. Then the voice of his wingman, Lieutenant Friedrich Weber, came through. Adler 2 confirming. Your target is damaged, breaking off engagement. Good shooting, Klaus. Good shooting. Was it? Klaus glanced down at the K-14 sight, its reticle now centered and still, waiting for the next target. The modification had been installed in only 5 aircraft in his Jagdgeschwader, an experimental rollout to evaluate combat effectiveness before wider deployment. Command wanted data, wanted proof that this technological leap would turn the tide of a war that everyone knew, privately, was already lost. Klaus turned his Bf-109 toward home, the February sun hanging low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the winter landscape. 4 months ago, the Allies had landed at Normandy. 3 months ago, Paris had fallen. The Red Army was grinding westward from the east, a slow, inexorable force that consumed everything in its path. Germany was dying, but the scientists and engineers kept working, kept innovating, kept producing wonder weapons that promised salvation even as the map contracted week by week.
The K-14 sight was supposed to be one of those weapons,
a force multiplier that could let veteran pilots like Klaus achieve higher kill ratios, buy time, delay the inevitable. But as Klaus descended toward the snow-dusted runway of Jüterbog Dam airfield, watching the ground crew scramble to clear the landing strip, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about the site was fundamentally different from what he'd been briefed to expect. The reticle had moved too smoothly, tracked too perfectly, almost as if it knew where the Mustang would be before the American pilot had even begun his maneuver. Klaus lowered his landing gear and lined up his approach, the afternoon light glinting off the ice-covered runway. In 3 hours, there would be a debriefing. In 3 hours, he would file his combat report and describe in precise technical language how the K-14 modification had performed. But first, he needed to think about what he'd just experienced, needed to understand whether what he'd felt in that moment of perfect tracking was real or imagined. The Bf-109's tires touched down with a chirp of rubber on ice, and Klaus let the aircraft roll to a stop near the dispersal area. Ground crew rushed forward with chocks and fuel trucks. His crew chief, Feldwebel Hans Diekmann, a grizzled veteran who'd been maintaining fighters since the Battle of Britain, climbed onto the wing to help Klaus with his harness. "How'd she handle her Oberleutnant?" Hans asked, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "I pulled off my leather flying gloves and looked at the K-14 site one more time before climbing out of the cockpit." "Different," he said finally. "Very different." The debriefing room at Jüterbog Dam was a converted storage facility that still smelled faintly of aviation fuel and gun oil despite the best efforts of the administrative staff. Klaus sat at a scarred wooden table across from Major Otto Brenner, his squadron commander, and a civilian in a gray suit who'd introduced himself only as Herr Dr. Fischer from the Reich Air Ministry's Technical Evaluation Section. The civilian's credentials had checked out with the base security officer, though Klaus noticed the man's hands were smooth and uncalloused, not the hands of someone who worked with machinery, despite the technical title. "Your report states that the K-14 modification achieved target lock at a range of approximately 800 meters, and that the reticle tracking felt autonomous in nature. Can you elaborate on what you mean by autonomous?" Klaus leaned forward, choosing his words carefully. The standard Revi sight requires the pilot to manually maintain the pipper on target while compensating for deflection angle and range. The K-14 is different. Once I had visual acquisition of the target aircraft, the reticle began tracking independently of my control inputs. It followed the Mustang's evasive maneuvers with what seemed like anticipation. Major Brenner, a stocky man with iron-gray hair and a Knight's Cross at his throat, frowned. "Anticipation? That's not how gyroscopic sights work, Klaus. The K-14 uses rate gyros to measure angular velocity and a mechanical computer to calculate lead angles. It responds to the target's current motion, not future motion." "I understand the technical principles, Herr Major. I'm telling you what I observed. The reticle movement preceded the target aircraft's maneuvers by what felt like a fraction of a second, enough to put my rounds exactly where the target would be, not where it was." Fischer made a note on his clipboard, his fountain pen scratching across the paper with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Herr Oberleutnant Reinhardt, are you familiar with the concept of predictive algorithms?" "I'm a fighter pilot, not an engineer."
"Of course." Fischer set down his pen and folded his hands on the table. "Let me explain in simple terms. The K-14 modification includes experimental components that go beyond mere gyroscopic compensation. We've integrated mechanical computing elements that analyze the target's flight pattern and extrapolate probable future positions. Think of it as a form of mechanical intelligence. Not consciousness, certainly, but a level of autonomous decision-making that far exceeds standard gunsight technology." Major Brenner's frown deepened. "You're telling me we've installed computing devices in our fighters? Devices that make tactical decisions?" "They don't make decisions, Major," Fischer corrected smoothly. "They provide enhanced targeting data based on probability matrices. The pilot remains in complete control. We simply give him better information faster than his unaided senses could gather it. Klaus thought about that for a moment. Who developed this technology? This goes far beyond anything I've heard about from Zeiss or the other optical manufacturers. Fisher's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, a moment of calculation before he answered. The K-14 project draws on research from multiple sources. Some of the optical components are derived from captured American technology, as you were initially briefed. The computing elements represent innovations from our research facilities at Peenemünde and elsewhere. The exact details are classified at the highest levels. Peenemünde, Klaus said the word carefully. Everyone knew about Peenemünde, the rocket research facility on the Baltic coast, where Dr. Werner von Braun and his team were developing the V-2 ballistic missile. It was also rumored to be a center for more exotic research projects, weapon systems that pushed the boundaries of conventional understanding. You're saying this technology comes from the rocket scientists? Among others. Fisher stood, gathering his papers. Herr Oberleutnant, your mission performance today exceeded our expectations. The K-14 modification functioned exactly as designed. We'll be conducting additional test flights over the next week with the other equipped aircraft in your squadron. I'd like you to continue flying missions with the modified site and maintain detailed logs of its performance characteristics. Can we count on your cooperation? It wasn't really a question. Klaus stood as well, coming to attention. Jawohl, Herr Doctor. After Fisher had left, Major Brenner poured 2 glasses of schnapps from a bottle he kept in his desk drawer and pushed one across to Klaus. Off the record, what do you really think about this K-14 business? Klaus accepted the glass but didn't drink immediately. I think it works. Better than anything we've had before. If we can get it installed across the entire Luftwaffe, it might actually give us a fighting chance against the American bomber formations. That's the official answer. Brenner downed his schnapps in one swallow. Now tell me what you're not saying. Klaus met his commander's eyes. Otto Brenner had been flying combat missions since the invasion of Poland in 1939. He'd survived 6 years of war, which meant he was either extraordinarily lucky or extraordinarily perceptive, probably both. You didn't reach the rank of major in the Jagdwaffe by 1945 without being able to read between the lines. It felt wrong, Klaus admitted. Not bad, not dangerous, just wrong. Like the aircraft was making decisions without me. I know Fisher said the pilot stays in control, but when that reticle is tracking a target with that kind of precision, you stop thinking about lead angles and deflection. You just pull the trigger when the sight tells you to. And you shot down a Mustang, without taking damage, without wasting ammunition, without putting yourself at unnecessary risk. From a tactical perspective, that's a perfect engagement. From a tactical perspective, yes. But Major, I've got 17 kills. I earned every one of them through skill, training, experience. Today felt like the aircraft got the kill, not me. Does that make sense? Brenner refilled both glasses. Perfect sense. But Klaus, this is February 1945. The war is lost. Everyone knows it, even if nobody says it out loud. We're flying missions to buy time, to let civilians evacuate ahead of the Red Army, to defend our homeland for as long as possible. If this K-14 technology helps us shoot down more Allied aircraft with fewer losses of our own, does it really matter whether it feels right? The question hung in the air between them. Klaus thought about the bomber crews he'd seen at previous bases, young men barely out of training who were sent up in outdated aircraft to face American P-51s and P-47s that outperformed them in every category. He thought about the ground crews who worked through freezing nights to keep fighters operational with dwindling supplies of spare parts and fuel. He thought about the refugees streaming westward on every road, trying to stay ahead of the advancing Soviet forces. No, he said finally. "It doesn't matter how it feels. What matters is results." Good man. Brenner raised his glass in a toast. To results, then, and to surviving long enough to see what comes after this war ends. They drank, and Klaus tried not to think about how thin the line had become between fighting for your country and simply fighting to survive one more day. That evening, Klaus sat in the officers' mess, nursing a cup of ersatz coffee that tasted like burnt chicory and trying to warm his hands around the chipped ceramic mug. The mess was crowded with pilots from the various squadrons based at Jüterbruck Dam, men ranging from hardened veterans like himself to fresh-faced replacements who'd barely completed training before being thrown into combat. The conversation was subdued. Nobody talked about politics anymore, and discussing military strategy was pointless when everyone could look at a map and see the writing on the wall. Friedrich Webers slid into the seat across from Klaus, carrying a tray with a bowl of watery soup and a hunk of black bread. Fritz was 23, 6 years younger than Klaus, with the kind of eager enthusiasm that war hadn't yet beaten out of him. He joined the squadron 3 months ago with a transfer from a training unit in Bavaria and had quickly proven himself a capable wingman. "Did Fischer grill you about the K-14? Fritz asked, tearing into his bread with the appetite of someone who'd grown up hungry and had never quite gotten used to having regular meals, even the poor ones they served in the military. "Debriefed," Klaus corrected. He wanted detailed performance data. "How did your flight go?" Fritz had been scheduled for an afternoon patrol in one of the other K-14-equipped aircraft, flying with a different flight leader. "Didn't encounter any enemy aircraft. Patrolled the corridor between here and Magdeburg, saw some Allied reconnaissance planes at high altitude, but nothing within engagement range. The sight is incredible, though, Klaus. I spent some time tracking cloud formations just to watch how it moves. It's like having a hunting falcon's eyes merged with your gunsight." The metaphor was more apt than Fritz probably realized. Klaus thought about how raptors tracked prey, making constant micro-adjustments in flight to maintain pursuit, operating on instinct and lightning-fast reflexes that humans couldn't match. The K-14 felt similar, an extension of predatory capability beyond natural human limits. "Did they tell you about the predictive algorithms?" Klaus asked. "Fischer mentioned it during my briefing yesterday. Probability matrices, mechanical computation, all very technical." He paused mid-bite. "You don't trust it?" "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to. I've been flying on your wing long enough to know when something's bothering you." Fritz leaned forward, lowering his voice. "This technology could save lives, Klaus, our lives. Whatever reservations you have about how it works, it's still better than going up against American fighters with standard sights and hoping our skill makes up the difference." Klaus couldn't argue with that logic. "Did you know that, according to the latest intelligence briefings, the Americans have achieved air superiority over 90% of German airspace? They fly daylight bombing missions with fighter escorts that outnumber us 10-1. Last month, we lost 43 pilots from this base alone. The K-14 is supposed to help even those odds." "And it will," Fritz said, with confidence that Klaus envied. "I've seen you shoot, Klaus. You're one of the best natural marksmen in the Jagdwaffe. Imagine what you could do with a sight that never misses, that compensates for every variable automatically. You could be an ace in a week." "I'm already an ace," Klaus pointed out dryly. 17 kills. "Then you could be a double ace, triple. The Americans make so many planes that shooting down 50 or 100 wouldn't even dent their numbers, but it would make you a legend. Think about that." Klaus didn't particularly want to think about that. Becoming a propaganda hero, having his face plastered on recruitment posters, giving speeches to factory workers about duty and honor while the Reich crumbled around them, none of that appealed to him. He joined the Luftwaffe in 1940 because flying had been his passion since childhood, and defending Germany seemed like a noble cause at the time. 5 years later, all the nobility had bled out of the war, leaving only necessity and survival. Before Klaus could formulate a response, the mess hall door banged open and Hauptmann Josef Steiner strode in, his flight jacket still zipped up and his face red from the cold. Josef was the commander of 2nd Staffel and one of Klaus's closest friends from training days in 1941. Where Klaus was methodical and careful, Josef was aggressive and intuitive, flying by feel rather than calculation. They made an effective team precisely because their styles complemented each other. Josef grabbed a coffee from the service line and joined them at the table, bringing with him the smell of aviation fuel and winter air. "You two look like you're plotting something seditious. Should I report you to the Gestapo or just shoot you myself and save them the paperwork?" "We're discussing the K-14, Fritz said. "Klaus has philosophical objections to technological superiority." "I don't have philosophical objections. I'm simply being cautious about a system we don't fully understand." "Klaus, my friend, you've been cautious your entire life. It's why you're still alive. But caution doesn't win wars."
"Neither does recklessness," Klaus countered. "You're getting the K-14 installation next week, aren't you?" "Tuesday." Joseph's expression grew more serious. "Command is prioritizing the most experienced pilots for the modification. They want the best shooters flying with the best equipment. Standard force multiplication doctrine." That made sense from a strategic perspective. Give your most capable fighters the tools to achieve maximum effect, concentrate force where it would have the greatest impact. Klaus had read enough tactical manuals to understand the theory. What bothered him was how it felt in practice, like they were becoming test subjects for experimental technology rather than pilots defending their homeland. "How many aircraft are getting modified?" Klaus asked. "Fisher said they're targeting 20% of the fighter wing by the end of the month. That's assuming production of the site assemblies can keep pace with installation schedules." Joseph stirred his coffee absently. "The real bottleneck is the computing components. Those have to be manufactured at specialized facilities, and with the bombing campaign hitting industrial targets constantly, production is sporadic at best." Fritz jumped in. "But if it works, if the K-14 really does what they claim, wouldn't it make sense to prioritize fighter production over other weapons? Stop making tanks and artillery and focus everything on aircraft in these modified sites?" "That's above our pay grade," Joseph said. "We fly the aircraft they give us, shoot at the targets they designate, and try not to die. Strategic resource allocation is somebody else's problem." The conversation shifted to less weighty topics after that. Gossip about transfers and promotions, speculation about where the front lines would stabilize, complaints about the quality of the food and the inadequacy of the heating system. Normal conversation for military personnel in wartime, the kind of talk that helped maintain sanity when external circumstances were insane. But Klaus's mind kept circling back to the K-14, to that uncanny feeling of the reticle tracking independently, to Fisher's carefully worded explanations about probability matrices and mechanical computation. Something about the whole situation didn't fit together properly, like a puzzle with pieces that were almost, but not quite the right shape. After dinner, Klaus returned to his quarters, a small room he shared with Joseph in one of the wooden barracks buildings that had been hastily constructed when the airfield expanded in 1943. The space was cramped but private, containing 2 narrow beds, a shared desk, and a wood-burning stove that provided barely adequate heat. Personal possessions were minimal, a few changes of uniform, some letters from home, photographs of family and friends who mostly lived in cities that had been bombed into rubble. Joseph came in 20 minutes later and immediately went to the stove, feeding it another log from their dwindling supply. "I talked to some of the maintenance crew after dinner, Hans Dickman and his people. Asked them about the K-14 installation process." Klaus looked up from the letter he'd been writing to his sister in Munich. And they say the modification requires more than just mounting a new gun sight. They have to run additional power lines from the aircraft electrical system, install a separate battery pack to ensure continuous operation even if the main system fails, and connect data cables to the engine instruments and airspeed indicators. The site isn't just passive optical equipment, it's integrated with the aircraft's core systems. That was news. Klaus set down his pen.
Why would a gunsight need to connect to engine instruments? According to Hans, the computing elements need real-time data about the aircraft's performance envelope. Speed, altitude, rate of climb or descent, engine RPM, all of it. The predictive algorithms use that information along with the target tracking data to calculate firing solutions. It's not just predicting where the target will be, it's predicting where your bullets will be based on your aircraft's current state. That's far more sophisticated than anything they told us during the briefing. Fisher made it sound like an enhanced gyroscopic sight with some computing assistance. What you're describing is a fire control system, Joseph finished, like what they use on naval vessels or anti-aircraft guns, except miniaturized and ruggedized for fighter aircraft installation. Klaus, this isn't just an upgrade, this is a completely different class of technology. They sat in silence for a moment. The only sound the crackling of the fire in the stove and the wind howling around the barracks. Somewhere outside, an aircraft engine coughed to life as ground crew performed routine maintenance checks. Where did this come from? Klaus asked. Germany's been losing the war for 2 years. Our industrial capacity is being systematically destroyed. How did we suddenly develop fire control technology that sounds like something from a science fiction novel? Joseph pulled off his boots and stretched out on his bed, hands behind his head. Maybe we didn't develop it. Maybe we captured it.
From who? The Americans don't have anything like this in their fighters. Neither do the British. I've read the intelligence briefings on Allied aircraft capabilities. Maybe not from them. Joseph's voice was carefully neutral. There have been rumors, Klaus. Stories about research facilities and remote locations, projects involving captured technology from unknown sources, things that don't appear in official reports. Klaus knew what Joseph was hinting at without saying it explicitly. Every military organization had rumors, stories that circulated among the ranks about secret weapons and classified programs. Most were nonsense, wishful thinking from people who wanted to believe their side had some hidden advantage that would turn the tide of the war. But occasionally, rarely, there was truth buried in the rumors. You're talking about the Schwarzwald Incident. Klaus sat up, suddenly very serious. I'm not talking about anything. But yes, that's what I'm talking about. Last summer, July, a patrol from Jagdgeschwader 400 reported an engagement with an unknown aircraft over the Black Forest. The craft had no visible propulsion system, performed maneuvers that should have been aerodynamically impossible, and disappeared from visual tracking at impossible speeds. 3 pilots filed reports. 2 were sent to psychiatric evaluation. The third was transferred to a research facility and never heard from again. I remember the rumors, Klaus admitted. Most people assumed it was either Allied prototype testing or mass hallucination brought on by high-altitude hypoxia. Maybe it was. Joseph lay back down. Or maybe it wasn't. And maybe, just maybe, someone recovered something from that incident, technology that we're now reverse engineering and installing in our fighters. Predictive fire control that seems like magic because it's based on scientific principles we don't fully understand. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. If the K-14 really did represent technology from an unknown source, whether Allied experimental programs or something more exotic, then its capabilities might go beyond what Fisher had disclosed. But it also meant they were flying with systems whose full functionality and failure modes were unknowable. Klaus picked up his pen again, then set it down. He couldn't focus on writing letters when his mind was churning through possibilities. Tomorrow, I'm going to talk to Hans directly, get more details about the installation process, the technical specifications, everything he knows. Be careful, Joseph cautioned. Fisher and his people from the Air Ministry are watching this program closely. They might not appreciate pilots asking too many questions about classified systems. I'm not asking about classified systems. I'm asking about the aircraft I'm flying, which is my right as the pilot responsible for operating it safely. Joseph smiled. That's a good rationalization. Just don't be surprised if Fisher decides you're more trouble than you're worth and has you transferred to some backwater base flying Stukas against Russian tanks. At this point, that might be safer than tangling with American fighter groups, Klaus muttered. They settled into their evening routine after that. Josef reading a paperback novel by candlelight while Klaus finished his letter and reviewed the next day's flight assignments. The schedule showed a dawn patrol along the Elbe River corridor, which was becoming increasingly active as Allied forces consolidated their positions in the west. There was also a note about a special briefing at 0800 hours for all K-14 equipped pilots, which Klaus suspected meant more sessions with Fisher and his data collection efforts. Sleep came eventually, though not easily. Klaus dreamed of aircraft that moved like living things, of reticles that glowed with their own internal light, of shooting down enemy planes that dissolved into smoke before they even crashed. In the dream, he had 100 kills, 200, 1,000, and still the American bombers kept coming, an endless stream of metal and machinery that blotted out the sun. He woke before dawn feeling unrested, dressed quickly in the freezing dark, and made his way to the airfield operations building through ankle-deep snow. Other pilots were already gathering for the morning briefing, stamping their feet and blowing on their hands while they waited for the duty officer to arrive with the day's orders. The special briefing turned out to be conducted not by Fisher, but by a Luftwaffe technical officer, a major from the Air Ministry's Equipment Division, who introduced himself as Major Kaufmann. He was younger than Klaus expected, perhaps 35, with the precise manner of an engineer rather than a combat pilot. "Gentlemen," Kaufmann began without preamble, "you've been selected as evaluation pilots for the K-14 fire control modification because of your combat experience and demonstrated marksmanship. Over the next 2 weeks, we'll be collecting detailed performance data from every mission you fly. This data will inform decisions about wider deployment and potential refinements to the system." He gestured to a large diagram mounted on the wall behind him, a cutaway technical drawing of the K-14 site assembly that showed far more complexity than the simple gyroscopic mechanism Klaus had imagined. The K-14 integrates 3 primary subsystems. First, a standard Revi C/12D reflector sight provides basic reticle display and illumination. Second, a gyroscopic sensor package measures aircraft angular rates and target angular rates, feeding this information to the computing unit. And third, and most importantly, the Mark IV predictor unit performs real-time ballistic calculations using input from the gyros, aircraft instruments, and target tracking data. One of the other pilots raised his hand. "Herr Major, where does the Mark IV predictor unit come from? That designation doesn't match any standard Luftwaffe equipment codes."
Kaufmann's expression didn't change. The designation is a translation from the original American nomenclature. The basic technology was captured from a downed P-51D Mustang that had been equipped with an experimental American fire control system. Our engineers at Zeiss reverse-engineered the mechanism and improved upon it significantly. That explanation matched what Klaus had been told initially, though it still felt incomplete. American fighter aircraft in 1945 didn't have anything approaching the capabilities he'd experienced yesterday. The standard American K-14 gyroscopic sight was an improvement over fixed reticles, certainly, but it didn't track targets with autonomous precision or predict future positions. Major Kaufmann continued the briefing, covering technical specifications, maintenance requirements, and reporting procedures. The pilots were expected to fill out detailed forms after every flight, documenting how the K-14 performed under various combat conditions, different altitudes, speeds, target aspects, and engagement geometries. The data would be compiled and analyzed by technical teams, who would use it to refine the system's algorithms. "One final point," Kaufmann said as the briefing was wrapping up. "You may experience what we call tracking hesitation during your initial flights with the modified system. This is normal. The K-14 is designed to work in harmony with the pilot's intentions, but it takes several hours of flight time for the system to calibrate to your individual flying style. Think of it as a breaking-in period. After 10 to 15 flight hours, the tracking should feel completely natural." Klaus exchanged glances with Joseph, who looked as puzzled as Klaus felt. A gunsight that calibrated to individual flying styles? That required not just mechanical computation, but something approaching adaptive learning. What kind of technology could do that in 1945? After the briefing, Klaus caught up with Major Kaufman as the officer was gathering his materials. "Herr, may I ask a technical question?" Kaufman looked up, his expression neutral but not unfriendly. "Of course, Oberleutnant Reinhardt, though I should warn you I'm not at liberty to discuss classified aspects of the system." "Understood. I'm curious about the calibration process you mentioned. How does a mechanical computing system adapt to individual pilot behavior?" Kaufman paused, considering his answer carefully. "The Mark IV predictor contains what we call a memory matrix, a series of mechanical switches and relays that can store information about repeated patterns. When you fly, the system records your typical responses to various situations. Over time, it builds a profile of your tendencies and uses that profile to refine its predictions. It's not true adaptation in the biological sense, but rather statistical pattern matching implemented through mechanical logic." The explanation was plausible, Klaus supposed, though it seemed extraordinarily sophisticated for mechanical technology. Vacuum tube computers like the ones he'd heard about in university lectures could perform logical operations and store information electronically, but miniaturizing that capability to fit in a fighter aircraft while maintaining reliability under combat conditions would be a remarkable achievement. "Thank you, Herr Meyer. That clarifies things." Kaufman studied Klaus for a moment, his eyes sharp behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "Oberleutnant Reinhardt, may I offer you some advice? The K-14 works best when you trust it. Pilots who overthink the system, who try to second-guess its calculations, achieve inferior results compared to those who simply fly naturally and let the technology do its job. You're an experienced marksman with excellent instincts. Use those instincts and let the K-14 enhance them rather than replace them." It was good advice, Klaus had to admit. The same principle applied to any advanced equipment. Learn to work with it rather than fighting against it. "I'll keep that in mind, Herr Meyer." The Dawn Patrol launched 30 minutes later, with Klaus leading a flight of 4 Bf-109s. Himself and Fritz in K-14-equipped aircraft, plus 2 wingmen in standard fighters. The weather was clear but bitterly cold, the kind of February morning where exhaust contrails formed almost immediately and hung in the air like white scars across the blue sky. They climbed to 7,000 meters and set course eastward, following the Elder River toward the advancing front lines. Intelligence reports indicated heavy Allied fighter activity in this sector, American P-51s and British Spitfires running escort missions for photo reconnaissance aircraft that were mapping German defensive positions in preparation for the next offensive push.
Klaus scanned the sky continuously, eyes moving in the pattern every fighter pilot learned. Check 6 o'clock, scan the horizon, glance at instruments, check 6 o'clock again. The K-14 reticle floated in his vision, centered and steady, waiting for targets. He tried not to focus on it, tried to let his awareness expand to take in the whole sky. Fritz's voice crackled over the radio. "Adler lead, contacts at 2 o'clock high, approximately 9,000 meters, count 4 aircraft." Klaus looked where Fritz indicated and spotted them. 4 tiny specks against the distant clouds, probably a photo reconnaissance flight with fighter escort. Range was still too great to identify specific aircraft types, but the formation spacing looked American. "Adler flight, climb to engage, maintain formation discipline." They increased throttle and pointed their noses skyward, climbing toward the enemy formation. The Bf-109's engine roared at maximum power, supercharger whining as it compressed thin air for combustion. Klaus watched his instruments carefully. Oil temperature rising but still in the green, coolant pressure stable, fuel consumption higher than cruise but acceptable for combat maneuvering. As they closed range, Klaus could make out details of the enemy aircraft. 2 P-51 Mustangs flying escort position around what looked like a de Havilland Mosquito reconnaissance plane, and probably a B-17 in a Pathfinder role. Standard Allied reconnaissance package. The K-14 reticle suddenly came alive, tracking the lead Mustang with that now familiar predatory fluidity. Klaus felt his breath catch as the circular pipper began moving before he'd even acquired the target visually. The sight was tracking, calculating, predicting, just as it had yesterday. But this time, something was different. The reticle flickered, split into two overlapping circles for a fraction of a second, then stabilized. Klaus blinked, wondering if ice had formed on his goggles, but the phenomenon repeated. The sight seemed to be showing him two possible futures, two paths the Mustang might take. "Adler lead! They've spotted us! Breaking formation!" The American fighters peeled away from their reconnaissance charges, diving and splitting in a classic defensive separation. The lead Mustang rolled inverted and pulled into a high G turn that should have grayed out its pilot. Klaus followed, watching the K-14 reticle track the maneuver with impossible precision. And then he saw it. Before the American pilot completed his roll, before the Mustang's nose came around to point at Klaus's aircraft, the K-14 reticle had already shifted to where the enemy fighter would be 3 seconds later. Not predicting based on current motion, actually knowing the future position with certainty that defied physics. Klaus's hands moved on instinct, pulling his Bf-109 into a climbing turn that brought him out of the Mustang's potential firing solution. The reticle tracked him, yes, but more importantly, it had warned him, shown him where danger would be before it materialized. "Gott im Himmel!" Klaus breathed. The engagement lasted 90 seconds, an eternity in air combat. Klaus fired twice, both times watching his tracers pass exactly through the space the K-14 predicted his target would occupy. The first burst missed, only because he'd hesitated, doubted the sight's impossible prescience. The second burst tore through the Mustang's left wing route, sending the American fighter into a flat spin.
Klaus watched the enemy pilot bail out, parachute blossoming against the winter sky, and felt something cold settle in his chest. This wasn't mechanical computation. This wasn't reverse-engineered American technology. This was something else entirely. "Adler League, all aircraft, break off engagement. Return to base immediately." Fritz's voice came back confused. "Klaus, we have them on the run." "That's an order, Lieutenant. RTB now." The flight back to Jüterberg Dam took 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours. Klaus's mind raced through implications, possibilities, impossibilities. The Schwarzwald Incident. Unknown aircraft performing aerodynamically impossible maneuvers. Technology that predicted the future. He landed hard, barely registering the jarring impact as his wheels hit ice. Hans Deichmann was waiting at the dispersal area, but Klaus brushed past him, still wearing his flight gear as he strode toward the operations building. Major Brenner looked up in surprise when Klaus burst into his office without knocking. "Klaus, what the hell?" "The K-14 doesn't predict, Herr Major. It knows. It showed me where that Mustang would be before the pilot had even decided to turn. That's not computation. That's not probability matrices. That's something else entirely." Brenner's expression shifted from surprise to resignation. He walked to his office door, locked it, then returned to his desk and poured 2 glasses of schnapps with hands that trembled slightly. "Sit down, Klaus." "I don't want to sit." "That was an order, Oberleutnant." Klaus sat. Brenner downed his schnapps, then poured another. "You're right. The technology doesn't come from America. It doesn't come from anywhere on this earth. Last summer, we recovered something from the Black Forest. Not an aircraft, wreckage. Pieces of something that our best engineers couldn't fully understand. But they could copy certain components. The K-14's core processor is one of those copies." Klaus felt the world tilt beneath him.
You're telling me we're flying with alien technology? I'm telling you we're flying with technology we don't understand from a source we can't identify because we're desperate and losing and willing to try anything that might give us an edge. Brenner's voice was bitter. Fisher and Kaufman and all the others from the Air Ministry, they think they've mastered it, turned it into a weapon we can control. But you felt it, didn't you, in combat? That moment when you realized the sight was smarter than you. Klaus nodded slowly. It's learning, Klaus. Every flight, every engagement, it learns more about how we think, how we fly, how we fight. The calibration period Kaufman mentioned isn't the sight adapting to us, it's studying us, building profiles, understanding human decision-making patterns. Why are you telling me this? Brenner met his eyes. Because in 3 days, every remaining fighter in the Luftwaffe is scheduled to receive the K-14 modification. Thousands of aircraft, thousands of pilots, all flying with technology that thinks. The High Command believes it's our miracle weapon, the thing that will turn the tide. But I've read the classified reports from Peenemünde. The scientists don't know what will happen when all those systems are networked together, sharing data, learning from each other. Klaus's mouth went dry. You're telling me they might coordinate, act independently? I'm telling you we're playing with fire we don't understand, and I think someone needs to be ready to pull the plug if things go wrong. Brenner pulled a folder from his desk drawer, sealed with red wax and marked with classification stamps. This contains documentation of everything we know about the K-14 project. The Schwarzwald Incident, the recovery operation, the reverse engineering program, all of it. If I give this to you, you become responsible for it. If the technology goes rogue, if the sites start making decisions that put our pilots at risk, you take this folder to the Allied forces and you tell them everything. That's treason, Herr Major. That's survival, Oberleutnant. The war is already lost. This, he tapped the folder, is about making sure we don't lose something worse. Our humanity, our free will, our ability to make our own choices even when they're bad ones. Klaus stared at the folder for a long moment, then reached out and took it. The wax seal felt cold against his fingers. There's one more thing, Brenner said quietly. The scientists at Peenemünde think the original craft might still be out there, watching, waiting to see what we do with the pieces we took. If they're right, and if they decide we're misusing their technology, he trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. Klaus stood, tucking the folder inside his flight jacket. What are you going to do? My job. Fly missions, follow orders, defend what's left of Germany until there's nothing left to defend. What are you going to do? Klaus thought about that. He thought about Fritz's enthusiasm for the K-14, about Josef's pragmatic acceptance, and about the hundreds of young pilots who would soon be flying with sights that knew their thoughts before they did. He thought about the Mustang pilot he'd shot down today, floating safely to Earth beneath his parachute, and wondered if that man's life had been saved or ended by technology from the stars. I'm going to keep flying, Klaus said finally. And I'm going to pay attention. Really pay attention. If these things are learning from us, maybe we can learn from them too. Figure out what they want, what they're trying to do. And if what they want is incompatible with human survival? Klaus's hand went to the folder inside his jacket. Then I know exactly where to take this.
3 weeks later, the war ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. American and Soviet forces met at the Elbe River. Berlin fell. The Third Reich collapsed into rubble and refugees and recriminations. Klaus Reinhardt surrendered to American forces on May 3, 1945, at a small airfield in Bavaria. He carried with him Major Brenner's folder and a request to speak with Allied intelligence officers about classified Luftwaffe technology. The debriefing lasted 3 days. The folder's contents were immediately classified at the highest levels by both American and British intelligence services. Klaus was told, politely but firmly, that he would never speak of the K-14 project again, that Major Brenner had died in the final defense of Berlin, and that all records of the Schwarzwald Incident had been destroyed in bombing raids. But Klaus knew better. He saw it in the eyes of the intelligence officers who questioned him, the recognition, the fear, the understanding that something had visited Earth in 1944 and left pieces of itself behind. He saw it in the way they confiscated every K-14 equipped aircraft they could find, shipping them to classified facilities in New Mexico and Nevada. Most of all, he saw it in the night sky, 20 years later, when reports of unidentified flying objects started appearing in newspapers around the world, objects that moved like the craft described in the Schwarzwald Incident, objects that seemed to be watching, waiting, checking on what humanity had done with the gift or warning they'd left behind. Klaus never flew again after the war. He became an engineer, working on early computer systems that seemed primitive compared to what he'd seen in 1945, but were advancing faster than anyone expected. Sometimes, late at night in his laboratory, he would catch himself wondering if the K-14's descendants were still out there somewhere, still learning, still adapting, still preparing for some purpose he couldn't fathom. And sometimes, just sometimes, he would look up at the stars and wonder if they were looking back. The question of whether humanity had been tested or warned, elevated or infiltrated, remained unanswered. Perhaps some questions were meant to stay that way. If you enjoyed this story, please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. Your subscription helps me continue creating these epic, novel-length narratives that take weeks of research and writing to produce. Ring that notification bell so you never miss when I release the next incredible story. Share this video with friends who love historical fiction, science fiction, or just great storytelling. These long-form stories work best when experienced all the way through, and I'd love to build a community of listeners who appreciate deep, thoughtful narrative experiences. Drop a comment below and let me know. Do you think the K-14 technology was a gift or a warning? What would you have done in Klaus's position? I read every comment and love hearing your thoughts and theories about the stories we explore together. Thank you again for spending this time with me. Until the next story, keep wondering, keep questioning, and keep looking up at the stars.